Chuck Todd is the host of Meet the Press. He's very, very bad at his job. He's very milquetoast. He's a conventional wisdom spewing machine. And what you're going to see here is probably the single worst example of that. So he's talking to the head of NATO, and look at this question. This is really astonishing.
We've seen an increased targeting of civilians, Mr. Secretary General, in Ukraine. How long can NATO stand by and watch Russia target civilians without finding a way to help more when it comes to the Ukrainian resistance?
NATO allies are stepping up their support to Ukraine, partly by delivering military support, humanitarian support, and billions of financial support to Ukraine. And then, of course, we also impose unprecedented sanctions on Russia to ensure that they are paying, President Putin is paying a high price for this totally unjustified, senseless war against an independent sovereign nation, Ukraine. And let me also remind you of the fact that NATO allies have actually trained and supported the Ukrainian armed forces for years, trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces, special operation forces, command and control, logistics, and all of this proves extremely important now. These troops are on the front line fighting against the invading Russian troops. So the support allies have provided over many years proves now to have been extremely important.
So that answer was actually a great answer. It was very thorough. It was factual. But the question was, how long can NATO stand by without finding a way to help more? He didn't give a single specific. Chuck, how would NATO help more? They have already, and this isn't hyperbole, they've already maxed out on the ways in which they could help short of war. They've maxed out. So he goes through it. Look, unprecedented sanctions. They're trying to implode the entire Russian economy, which, by the way, I condemn that because now Russian civilians are being hurt, and Russian civilians, many of them, are not even in favor of the war. They were protesting Putin in the street. But they say unprecedented sanctions, military support, humanitarian support. NATO has been training forces for years, and that's true. The CIA has been training forces for years, including the Azov Battalion, by the way. That's the uncomfortable fact that, is not often discussed nowadays, but it's true. And they've been providing logistics. So, wait a second. If every sanction under the sun has been unleashed, if we're giving all the humanitarian support in the world and all the military support in the world and logistical support, etc., Chuck, what else is there to do? How else can NATO, quote-unquote, help? Now, there's a reason he doesn't give any more specifics. He doesn't give any more specifics because if he did, it would be obvious what he's calling for is World War III. Again, this isn't hyperbolic. This is barely it's a millimeter under the surface. It's barely under the surface. So my guess is the implication in what he's saying there is, why are you not doing a no-fly zone? That's my guess. That's my guess. Because that's the thing that people who are unfamiliar with the specifics of this, they would say, well, that sounds surgical, and that sounds very above the fray, and that sounds like it's not, an act of war, effectively. But it is an act of war. It absolutely is an act of war. And the polls have reflected this too. A majority of people supported the idea of a no-fly zone if you just ask them, do you support a no-fly zone? Then when you actually explain what it is, that, hey, this is an act of war, all of a sudden support for it plummets. And it's way under 50%. So, but what Chuck Todd is doing here is he's inferring, you got to do more. Well, what is more? Is it NATO directly starting a war with Russia on the ground? Like NATO shooting at Russia? Is it the no-fly zone where NATO or the U.S. shoot Russian planes out of the sky in Ukraine? What else is it, Chuck? What is it? What else do you want? He can't say anything because if he does tell you the things that would be more help, it would be obvious what he's asking about is, why haven't you started World War III? It's just pathetic. It's just conventional wisdom spewing machine. I mean, what we've seen in this conflict, without any doubt, is that corporate media, every question they ask is pressure from the right, pressure from a more hawkish perspective. And we saw this the other day. I mean, we covered the video, and I'm sure many of you guys watched it, where Jen Psaki was answering questions on Ukraine from the media, and virtually every single question, I mean, in the Super Cup, what was it? 7, 8 questions? They were all like, Why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you doing a no-fly zone? Why aren't you listening to Zelensky? Why aren't you helping more? And the only question that wasn't like that was Ryan Grimm's question. It was the only one. It was the only one. So, guys, this is how you manufacture consent. This is how, if you repeat it over and over and over, and you're not specific as to what the stakes are if you do these things, well, then the perspective of the American people, anybody who's consuming this stuff on a regular basis, they're going to start to think, yeah, why aren't they doing more? Yeah, what's going on here? What's the problem? Why aren't you listening to Zelensky? Why aren't you helping? Why aren't you doing a no-fly zone? And so this is how you get a population to, lean more in favor of a more bellicose response and, honestly, World War III. But, of course, my guess is if the U.S. government or NATO were to take actions that are akin to World War III and we're in World War III, all of a sudden the public would be like, what? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? But, the media is pushing everybody in that direction. And they're just so bad at their job. They're so bad at their job. And he's the worst, honestly, Chuck Todd. The whole show, he's never had an original thought in his life. He just always goes right to the conventional wisdom. He's not a deep thinker. He thinks this is some sort of truth-telling, holding the powerful to account type question. And it's not. It's not at all. It's actually a dangerous line of questioning. So, this is terrible, man. It's so bad. It's so bad. Honestly, NATO has done absolutely everything short of World War III. The U.S. has done everything short of World War III. And obviously, that's a line you can't fucking cross in the nuclear age. You just can't do it. And again, my criticism is that, if anything, things have gone too far because now you're hurting Russian civilians with the sanctions. I have no problem whatsoever. In fact, I vehemently support the idea of sanctioning Putin, sanctioning the oligarchs, sanctioning the Russian military. I'm in favor of every sanction you can levy on that front. But all these sanctions that hurt regular people, it's just collective punishment. That's all it is. That's all it is. And it's this sense of hysteria and mania that's captured the country now where they think there's nothing we could do that's too tough if the people in question are Russian, even if they didn't do it. They didn't do anything wrong. So Chuck Todd, for the love of God, step down from your position. He's so in over his head, and it's so obvious. I mean, he's so bad at this. Not to say previous hosts of Meet the Press were wonderful. They weren't. But, I mean, he really is the worst of the worst. He really is the worst of the worst. And the casual underlying assumption and everything he's saying here is, why haven't we done World War III yet? I don't know, Chuck. Maybe because it's World War III, and it is apocalypse in the real world. It's Armageddon. It's holy shit, people's fingers are a millimeter away from the big red buttons. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's that. Ever since Adpocalypse, when YouTube defunded all independent news and politics overnight, we haven't trusted them. We know they can pull the rug out from underneath us at any time. If you enjoy this content, please consider tipping $1 or $2 per month on the Secular Talk Patreon. Link in the video description box below. Thanks for your support.